Welcome. My name is Molly Ness, and I currently serve on the board of the International Literacy Association. In 2019, I began the End Book Deserts podcast to bring attention to the issue of book access and equity. That work has now spread to the Coalition for Literacy Equity, which you can find out more about at www.litequity.com. Earlier this month, ILA released The Essential Leadership of School Librarians, which I co-authored with Margaret Murga and Julia Torres. The later, you'll hear from them later. And while we were working on that brief, censorship efforts in the United States soared, leading to nearly 1,600 books being removed from school librarians across the United States last year alone. While much of the focus has been on the US, tonight we're going to broaden the lens and look at the impact of censorship in school libraries across the globe. We'll hear from an amazing group of experts in the field of school librarianship. Afterward, we encourage you to join the conversation in breakout spaces of your choosing to ask questions, offer insight, reflect, and connect with colleagues from around the world. But before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. As you can see, the chat is enabled, so please feel free to introduce yourself, share reflections and resources and your thoughts throughout our time together. We're almost at capacity for participating in Zoom, which is a great problem to have and speaks to how interested people are in this topic. To ensure that everyone who wants to listen in can, we are simultaneously live streaming this discussion on Facebook. The recording of the event will be available within the next few days, and you'll be able to access that at literacyworldwide.org/digital events. And lastly, if you're tweeting along, please remember to tag ILA at ILA Today and use the hashtag ILA Webinar. Now, let's get to the meat of While You're Here. First, we are going to hear from Annette Caberu, ILA board member and librarian and literacy consultant, who will provide a glimpse into Uganda's libraries. Due to time differences and the spotty Wi-Fi, Annette recorded her remarks in advance.
Hello, I'm happy to be part of this talk. My name is Annette Caberu, a trained librarian from Uganda. I am a member at large at Ila, and I've been a chairperson of the Reading Associations of Africa. I have been a trained librarian for some good years after I worked as a secretary for 10 years. Reason why I changed is because I loved reading, I loved telling stories to the children, and I loved being around books, plus getting to learn new words. In Uganda, all schools should have a school library, and that library should have reading materials. But unfortunately, there's no mention of a school librarian. A few international schools that we have in Uganda and some private schools have tried to have librarians. But the public schools are struggling because of the big numbers with less materials to read, and then the payment for the school librarians. I have worked with different NGOs to try and boost the reading culture in Uganda. And we've trained school librarians, we've had books donated, and we had different things that happen around. We've introduced the Dear Day, Drop Everything and Read, which is now on the national calendar. I really believe that the librarians spin the wheel of knowledge and leisure, and we should treasure them as they are an asset to our little ones. I will end with a saying of the Chinese that says, the faintest ink is stronger than the strongest memory. I don't know whether I've quoted it right, but I think that is what it means. Thank you very much, Ila, and thank you everyone for listening to me.
Thank you to Annette for sharing the state of school libraries in Uganda. And next, we will hear from Julia Torres, who I mentioned was a co-author on the essential leadership of school librarians. And we've linked the brief itself in the chat, so be sure to share that and access it. Julia is a librarian and an ELA teacher in the Denver Public Schools, and she's a leader in the field. She's the co-founder of the Disrupt Text movement, a prolific writer and a presenter. She had to catch a plane tonight, but we couldn't imagine having this event without her voice. So she graciously sent us her remarks as well.
Hi, I'm Julia Torres. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Giving the gift of your time is one of the greatest things that anybody can give, I think, it at any time in life, but also during these times when we really, most of us just want to be curled up in front of the TV or with a book. It's a huge honor for you to be here joining us tonight to learn and think with us as we talk about libraries and intellectual freedom. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about book banning, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about book access. I am honored to be able to join the folks who will be on this panel tonight. Thank you so much for allowing me to pre-record my comments too. I want to thank the International Literacy Association because I am on my way to Minneapolis to work with some librarians as we talk about the shifting role of librarians and what we can do to protect intellectual freedom in their particular environment. So one of the things I want to talk to you about tonight is the importance of social access. We know that libraries provide intellectual access for young people, but also social access to books. And some of the organizations that are fighting to continue social access to books, and when I say social access, I mean an environment that protects a student's right to get the books that they want to read, share in the experience of reading them with other young people, and then talk about them, not just under the guidance of an adult, but also as we lift up young people as leaders to talk about the books that they love amongst themselves. I know that there is a group called #Freedom out of Texas. I believe they're out of Texas. And that would be #FREAD. Read is in there, OM. And one of the things that I love about them is that they are making sure that they keep young people at the center of everything that they do, both the stories that they amplify and the individuals that they are fighting for. I'm also very honored to be able to say that I am a proud partner of the Book Love Foundation, that is an organization that is nonprofit and works consistently to make sure that there are classroom libraries provided to teachers that need them across the United States. I am also very proud to say that I am an Amelia Elizabeth Walden Award Committee member. It has been really interesting to be able to have access to and read hundreds, if not by now, I've been exposed to maybe 1,000 books that have been published for young people over the last 2 years. And one of the trends that I've noticed is that we are living in a time when there are so many rich stories being written for young people. There is no reason why we need to continue to fall back on the books that we as adults loved and are nostalgic for, rather than making space for the stories that reflect the lived realities of the young people we serve. I am very passionate about the work that I do with Disrupt Text. And one of the key elements of Disrupt Text is to make sure that people understand that there is a place for books written by and for people from the margins in classrooms, and not just as part of independent reading units, but as part of intellectual studies. We believe very firmly that stories written by and for people from the margins belong as centered intellectual studies in our classrooms. So I can say that if you are looking to learn a little bit more about what I believe and a little bit more about some of the groups that I talked about, you can visit Freedom, you can visit Book Love Foundation, you can visit disrupttext.org or .net. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into tonight's conversation. Thank you so much for, again, just offering a few moments of your time. And I hope that you will remain curious, develop critical thinking, and prioritize intellectual freedom and the stories written by and for people from the margins. Okay, good night. Have fun.
Thank you to Julia for sharing her insights and expertise with us this evening. And if you don't follow Julia on social media, I would encourage it, as she is always lending a voice to the issues that she is thinking so much about. I'm delighted to introduce you to our 3 participants for today's roundtable discussion. First, Valerie Glass is a certified teacher librarian in France. Since 2016, she has worked at Cité Scolaire International in Lyon. And I apologize for my French. Prior to this role, she has worked in several middle schools and a high school in Saint-Denis outside of Paris. At the national level, she is a member of the National Board of APDEN, which is the French Federation of School Librarians. She's led the organization's international relations since 2015. She's the current chair of the local APDN of Lyon, and she is the chair of School Library section of the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. Lucy Santos Green is a professor of information science at the University of South Carolina, where she teaches and researches on school librarianship and instructional technology. As a former classroom teacher and school librarian, she writes and presents on technology integration and school library services for marginalized populations. She's the co-editor of the International Association of School Librarianship's journal, School Libraries Worldwide. Her latest book, LGBTQIA+, Inclusive Children's Librarianship Policies, Programs, and Practices, will be available in May. And Jennison Lucas is a K-12 district librarian in Cody, Wyoming. As the only certified school librarian in her school district, she oversees librarians in 7 buildings with paraprofessionals at 5 of them. She has been a school librarian for 20 years and has maintained her national board certification for 17 of those years. She's been active in her state and national school library associations by serving in various committee and leadership roles, and she currently serves as the president of the American Association of School Librarians. Without further ado, I'm thrilled to welcome Valerie, Lucy, and Jennison.
Everyone.
Hello to everyone.
We 3, are we all unmuted?
Yeah, we are all unmuted to have this conversation. Welcome, everyone. And I am excited about talking with Valerie and Jennison about this today. We've sort of inhabited each other's worlds where we kind of cross each other's paths every once in a while, but we don't usually have the opportunity to sit down and chew on this information. And it's true that it seems like the news story of the day are the book ban events that are happening in the US, but this is a global pattern that we see, and it's also not a new pattern. Historically speaking, we have seen banning of books and banning of ideas happen as long as I think humans have had ideas. So I am very excited about this conversation today. I wanted to kick us off a little bit by asking a few questions and getting the convo going, but I also want to encourage everyone, throw your ideas in the chat as well. As you're discussing this. And really, one thing I do want to ask, I always ask as we participate in these conversations, is take the time to self-reflect a little bit. Because right when you think you have your mind set on something a certain way, or you look at something a certain way, there's always going to be something that's going to confront your comfort, confront the way that you make sense of things. So I'm hoping everyone's open to that discomfort today. Jess, I'm going to kick it off to you if you would like to say anything before we jump into some questions.
Yeah, I was thinking about this on my way to escape my school building and the bells at the end of the day, and was just thinking that, okay, friends, it's time, let's buckle up and dive into this conversation that I've not had a conversation with any educator or other school librarian that has not had something to do with this censorship and intellectual freedom issue in probably the last year and a half. And so I know that that's happening everywhere, and it's great to be able to work and have a conversation. And I want to thank the International Literacy Association for this, bringing school librarians into the literacy conversation. We have been feeling a little on the outside of that with being a foot in the literacy world, a foot in the library world, a foot in the education world, and we don't have enough legs for that.
Yeah.
So it's great to be able to branch that out a little bit. And I'm excited about this conversation as well. Thank you, Lucy. And we'll kick that off to, is it Valerie? Is that how you say
Yes.
your name? Okay. So would you like to do a quick introduction?
Okay, so about censorship in school libraries around the world. So I asked some of my colleagues from the IFLA school library section about it. So I got some feedback from mostly European countries like Germany, UK, Croatia, Italy, and France. Also, I got some feedbacks from my Russian colleague, and also someone from who used to work in Hong Kong. So it seems that in Hong Kong, there are censorship very strongly in schools and public, and as you may know, because there is a national security law in China. And in Russia, my Russian colleagues told me that she hadn't encountered censorship in practice, but she told me that there were like a law to protect children from I don't know how to say, but publication which can hurt children's sensitivity, and so it seems like it's more or less control about children publication. But in European countries, it seems like more a question of sensitivity to sexual questions, or it depends on the schools, but it doesn't seem so much more an issue in this country.
Hmm. It's interesting, Valerie, you brought up a couple of things as you were reporting about what you heard from the IFLA committee. And this is the Committee of School Librarianship, right? The SIG, the Special Interest Group for School Librarianship. I recently visited, this is before the pandemic, visited Russian school libraries. And one thing I learned about the Russian school library program is that before perestroika, the Russian government would actually purchase all the library books and ship them to the schools. And so the librarians themselves did not have collection development authority over the book purchases. And once perestroika ended and schools began to take ownership of the purchasing, and this is not just what we would consider primary and secondary schools, but also colleges, institutions of higher education, it became a real budget issue, because it was like they were balancing their thrill at being able to purchase books with all of a sudden the need for the money to do that, because it was, something that the government had taken control of in many ways to control the narrative. And many of the schools to this day still receive a very specific collection of books highlighting Russian culture that is approved by the government, that they want the school librarians to emphasize to young readers. And so that to me was very interesting, that tension existed. But the other thing that I hear coming out of this, and Jocelyn, I also want to kind of ask you about this. One thing that we see happening, and again, not just in the US, is this idea that from a historical perspective, book bans happen in a climate where education overall is used for scoring political points, either one way or the other. And my question to you both, one thing I'd like for us to discuss a little bit is how can we take back that narrative? And I'll give you an example. Right now, a terminology that's being used is the verbiage parents' rights. So how can we take back the narrative when terminology such as that is being, again, thrown around? And also, how do we, again, discuss this from a historical perspective, the fact that we do have to discuss education with communities, with parents, with stakeholders, when we use language as professionals that has a meaning that is different in casual conversation. So even here in this panel, we're using terminology like intellectual freedom or critical thinking. And those are not terms that may mean the same thing to someone who's not an educator or not a school librarian. So how, again, that's my question to y'all, is how do we have these discussions thinking about, again, how these terms have been used over time to score these political points, and not the purview of just one party, but either way. Mm-hmm. I'm curious how that looks in different parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will. Go ahead, Valerie.
No, go.
I find that this is very interesting, this idea of parents' rights, and that the people who are complaining about parents not having rights to share what their beliefs are because we let kids check out whatever they want from the library are actually trying to reduce the amount of rights that parents have to choose for their own children. Mm-hmm. And we just went through a book challenge this week in my district. And that was one of the things that the people on our committee said is, I like the idea of being able to choose about this book for my child. I don't think any of them wanted their child to read this particular book, but they didn't want this person who didn't even have students in our school to make that choice for them. And so it's interesting that that's being used as a kind of a thing of, but your librarians are pushing this on your kids, and they're not seeing that that's not the case. If we have it available, you can talk to your child about whether or not you want them to read it. But if we don't have it available, you can't have that conversation. Mm-hmm. So I just find that incredibly interesting. And I'm trying to think about ways to explain that, at least in my district, to the constituents who are bringing the books forward.
It's been, fascinating. Valerie.
Yeah, it's been like, yes, when you talk about parents' rights, it seems that more and more parents, for instance, I have some example in France, parents are more and more involved in the choice of book and which books do their children should read in schools. And I think there are more and more cases from what I heard from school librarians in France, and there are some school librarians are very worried about which book can I choose from my book challenge, because some subjects seems very sensitive to some students about sexuality. And it seems that the age of the readers just seems a problem for some school librarians. But usually the parents don't have the right to forbid a book in French schools.
Yeah, one thing that jumps out at me, again, is this concept of my relationship to my child and what I perceive as the kind of level of access that I want my child to have. So I probably have a different way of looking at that than, say, my next door neighbor, mm-hmm. or the person across the street, or the person across town. And the library, whether it be a public library or a school library, its job is to serve the needs of the community as a whole and not one individual child. And so conflating those two is what's happening, right? We're confusing this concept of parents' rights. We're individualizing the library's service when it's really service to the whole. And that to me has been really interesting. Another thing that I have learned to think about very carefully, again, goes back to the terminology, the way that we're using words. I'm not a native English speaker. I was born in Brazil and immigrated to the United States in 7th grade. And one thing that I learned about the English language is that one word can mean 27 different things. And I think that makes English in particular much harder than people realize to learn. And so right now, today, again, we're using the term book banning or book challenges, but really that term means something different than I think we sometimes use. We use the term book banning when really we might be meaning book relocation or book redaction. And I wanted to share an article here in the chat by Dr. Emily Knox. She wrote Book Banning in the 21st Century. This is an open source article, so the link is accessible. And one thing I really like about this particular article is that she discusses these different definitions that we tend to tie with book banning, relocation, redaction, and then finally removal, which is really banning. It's removal. That's when we get to banning. The other reason I want to share this article is because it kind of takes me to the next point I want to discuss with y'all. While we do see a slight increase in the amount of diverse books published in the US, and I think even we can say on a global level, it's still not where it needs to be by any means at all. So if you think about the smallest percentage of books that are published right now are books with diverse protagonists, diverse authors. At the same time, the majority of bans that we're seeing are affecting that small slice of the pie. And so these bans, especially right now, are making an enemy of marginalized identities, whether they be people of color, whether they be LGBTQIA individuals. We're seeing in this ban. And another thing that Stacy Collins, who is a research librarian at Simmons, has brought up is what we're seeing is also banning of any stories that have to do with activism. And so that's been really kind of scary, I think, to think about. Again, we have all this literature for children and for youth, but a small percentage of it is what's being targeted. So that brings me to my next question to y'all. And Valerie, you touched on this a little bit earlier when you were talking about books that are appropriate, right? That librarians, parents, there's this push for books that are appropriate. This term we use, age appropriateness, it seems to be a justification for many of these challenges. But we don't really have a clean definition for age appropriateness. And so I'm wondering, what is age appropriateness? What does it actually mean? What should it actually mean? And when we talk about age appropriateness, are we considering any of the research that tells us that kids process what they are ready and capable of processing? I know in my experience, I have seen kids over and over again self-censor for themselves. So very, very interested to hear y'all comment on this concept of age appropriateness, and also in the chat if you have some thoughts about that, because I find this to be a very elastic and dangerous term. Jenison, I'm just going to highlight you. Okay. What do you think?
When I opened up the document that we were writing some of these down, and this jumped right out at me big time, because in the book challenge that was before a committee on Monday night, this is one of the things I was asked. How do you determine age appropriateness? And who gets to decide what's age appropriate to put in our libraries? And I was like, well, this can be complicated, but one of the things you have to start with and understand is that school librarians are educators. We have expertise in education. We have to have had coursework on education and on child development and on how to actually look at text to understand who it might fit for. We are usually the only person in our building who has had any kind of actual training in how to evaluate a source of any kind. And I said, since we can't read the books ourselves, we do a lot of relying on reviews and, School Library Journal, Hornbook, Kirkus Reviews, Publishers Weekly, and they usually provide an age range. Those articles are also written by librarians who have the same kind of training and have gotten to read the book, so we look at a lot of those and then make a professional judgment on what we think based on what we see in our schools, what we know about our kids, what we know about child development, and that knowing that kids do self-censor. They will pick up a book and be like, yeah, I'm not ready for this yet. And they can't voice why, but they know. And they're like, yeah, this is not for me yet. Or it's just never going to be for me or whatever. Mm-hmm. And we tend, people who, in my experience, people who are wanting to censor materials and completely remove them from our schools are more worried about whether they are ready for a conversation with a child and whether or not that child is ready for that conversation, because the kid can read through a book and never even pick up on that thing that the parent is worried about because they're not ready to recognize it. And so their conscious doesn't pick up on it. They read the book later and it falls right into place. And now they understand. And now they have words to ask the questions that they need to ask. Yeah. And I don't ever underestimate our children. And because they are brilliant. And there's part of me, like my son is 8 years old, and just watching him, I swear, I think that he was born knowing everything and he's just figuring out how to make sense of it now. Yeah. And it's like, we have to be ready as adults and gatekeepers to answer the questions in a way that we know that our child will understand. And we as a parent know what is age appropriate for our child based on where he is. And to take that away from somebody else is just not acceptable.
Yeah. Valerie, what do you think?
Yes, I agree with Jenison. It seems that, for instance, in France, school librarians agree about the fact that some books can be read, for children. Can be read. Books can be read for some book can be read by young children, and there is like some students are more mature than others to read some books, and some don't. And I think it's up to the school librarians to engage a conversation about a book to tell students that maybe it will shock you or not, or it's every child is different. So and some are more mature than others. So I agree with what you said, Jenison.
There are two things that popped out at me, Jenison, when you were talking. The first is this sense of disrespect that we pick up sometimes about the professionalization of educators and school librarians. So sometimes it feels like there is a lack of acknowledgement and respect for the training, the education that we have to select these materials, to develop these materials, and also this belief that your feelings of comfort or discomfort about a topic are not the only rule that needs to be used when selecting materials. There are all kinds of things that we have to look at. And again, that plays into our professionalism. that plays into our training, that plays into our expertise. And like some folks, put in the chat here, many librarians are required to get they have to get a master's degree. They have to get additional training and certification in order to be a school librarian, to be a public librarian, academic librarian. It requires a special level of training. Many teachers also have advanced degrees and trainings and certifications. And even to maintain the initial certification that they have to continue to have that training. That's right. And so that's important. And I'm getting a little bit of an echo there, y'all. I'll stop for a second. Are y'all getting a little bit of an echo? Okay, there, it went away. All right. The other thing that jumped out at me, Jennison, when you were talking was the concept of the discomfort on the part of the adult. So as you were saying, man, that was just like a snap, is it that you're afraid the child is not ready, or is it that you're not ready to face that topic with that child? Whether it be systemic racism, is it because you're not ready to talk about systemic racism? Is it because you're not ready to acknowledge that racism exists? Is it because you're not ready to maybe discuss your past or your family's past or beliefs you had 10, 20 years ago? And so to me, that was huge. I mean, that is the thing, right? Our own discomfort, again, it should not be that measuring line for what a child has access to. So thank you for that. That was two little things that just jumped out at me there. Two big things. So one thing here that's coming up are this difference in ages. We are seeing a massive push against books that we want, what we call here in the US, middle and high school students, and I know are referred to as secondary students, ages 11 to about 18, 19 in some other countries. There's the pushback there, but then there's the other second really huge level of pressure faced by our primary teachers and school librarians. And these are elementary folks servicing children ages anywhere from as young as 2, if an elementary school has a preschool program, all the way up to 10, 11. And if it includes 6th and 7th grade, 12, 13. So can I ask y'all about that? What are the unique pressures that are faced by our librarians right now that are working with our younger kids? And what are some maybe advice or any points that you have, things that you've learned recently, like Jennison in your latest book ban challenge that happened this week, that y'all would like to talk about and share?
Well, I'll step in and say our book challenges in my district are kind of just starting, and for this year anyway, And we talked to, and I have had this discussion with a parent before because he's not ready to talk about romance with his children, which as far as I can tell means that he might have the only second grader in the world who has not seen the movie Frozen. I don't know how that happened, but the book that he didn't like was Drama by Raina Telgemeier, and it's a middle school book. But we hit this issue with the accelerated reader program that that school had labeled the books, and its readability level is at a second grade level. And so his second grader checked it out, and it's not really designed for second graders. I totally agree with him on that. But taking it out of all of our schools, because his second grader, he didn't want to talk about the issues in this book with his second grader. He doesn't want to talk about kissing and dating and never mind the homosexuality or anything else. And he was talking about his daughter's body language when she was reading it, that she was kind of squirming about it, like she knew there was something wrong. And he interpreted that as that his daughter wasn't ready to read it. Whereas I would have interpreted that differently and interpreted that as she was kind of interested in it. And that's why she kept reading it, but she thought she was going to get in trouble for it.
Right.
And so that idea of some books are at a lower reading level than their content might might suggest is one of the things for that lower level. But I think a lot of it is we want to keep our youngest kids as innocent as we can, as long as we can. And we don't always understand that there is serious hurtful behavior that starts to happen in elementary school on recess and things like that, where kids get called names and they don't understand. The kid that's calling the name doesn't really understand what it actually means. And the kid who feels like they might identify with that certain name are worried about that and not sure how to explain it because they don't want it to be worse. And so we want to try to keep it so that they don't encounter anything that's different from what we have in our family. And or that we don't want to open up the big wide world because we're afraid that they can't handle it, but they can if we're ready to talk about it, kind of thing. But it is tough when you have those littles and their understanding of the world is still being developed and they have not been exposed to as many things yet, to bring that into the forefront and end up with parents feeling that uncomfortableness of, okay, I guess I have to explain this now. And it's earlier than I thought. So
Valerie.
Okay, about younger children across the world, I only can speak from for France because I don't have. I'm not sure there are school librarians in primary schools across the world. Most of my colleagues work in secondary schools. And so as in France, there are no school librarians in primary schools. So we only have a certified teacher librarian for middle and high school. This is to say from 11 years old to 18 years old. So I cannot speak about younger children than 11 years old. So
yeah, sure. One thing that jumps out at me, before I was a school librarian, I was a music teacher. And one of the concepts in music education that we talk about a lot that I think applies here is this concept of introducing the unknown. And so just because a child cannot define at a young age what a 16th note is, or can't define or describe or identify a syncopated rhythm, it doesn't mean that they aren't ready to perform that rhythm. And so there is that little bit of disconnect between the level of the content, like you were saying, Jennison, and the topic itself, right? The material itself. And so the professional, again, the educator, the trained librarian, understands this difference. We understand that if you are over a library that has to meet the needs of younger students and older students, then you're going to have books that are a higher level of maturity content, but have a lower reading level because you have older students who are still working with their reading and they are struggling. And you're not going to get those students to read younger books. They're not interested in reading a picture book. If you're 15, you're not going to do that. But you need to read about topics you're interested in and that are at a younger reading level. On the flip side, you have very young kids who have very high reading levels sometimes, and they get bored. They want to read something that's a little bit more challenging, but they may not be emotionally, or they might not have the maturity, right? And so again, it's that expertise that we bring to the table. How do I pair you with a book that meets your needs, both at the content level, right? Both at what you're ready to explore and also what you're capable of exploring. And I think, again, that speaks to our need to appreciate the expertise that we bring to the table. But I would also flip that over and say, that's on us to explain, that's what you're getting. That's what you're getting when you have a school librarian, when you have an educator helping you select curriculum, preparing to teach your child, you're getting that expertise. Another thing I think that works with younger kids, again, will help elementary librarians and school librarians and teachers that are working with younger age children, is bring in those parents that you know are going to be on your side.
Mm-hmm.
So in Georgia and in South Carolina, we're seeing that there are white parents who don't want to talk about racism. They don't want to have these issues brought up with when they say their young children are not ready to talk about it. Well, guess what? There are kids in this class that are young and they are facing it.
Mm-hmm.
They are living it day to day. And if they're not too young to experience it, you're not too young to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So bring in those parents. Bring in the parents that you know want it to be addressed, need it to be addressed. They desire that discussion. They desire that conversation. Bring them in and have them be there with you, because the loudest voice is not the majority opinion. It's just the loudest voice.
Mm-hmm.
So outnumber those folks. And I think that that's really what I want. That's my declaration on that one. Don't let the loudest voice be the strongest, biggest opinion. It's not. It's just the loudest voice. So anyway, Jennison, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that is a lot of what happens in Wyoming too, because I think we have a 96% white population.
Yeah.
And a lot of them honestly don't seem to understand that some of the things that they do and say are not appropriate.
Right.
And I worry about the handful of Black children that are coming through our school district about the things that they will hear. And yet there are people in my area that will say that we don't have racism.
Yeah.
And it's like, but what you just said was. And then the next challenge that is coming up in my district is for Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had this meeting. It's like, this ties several things we've been talking about, that he probably said in this meeting, this is not censorship. This is about selection.
Yeah.
As many times as he said, I am not questioning your professionalism, but.
Correct.
And I was like, okay, so first of all, it is about censorship.
Mm-hmm.
Because you want us to pull this entire idea. You want all of this author's books removed. Mm-hmm. You are telling me that he's not mainstream, which is debatable. And I, you know, of course, then again, that makes him the other point of view that we're probably looking for in our collection. But, and you're stabbing me in the side with this. I'm not questioning your professionalism, you know, but you're wrong.
Right.
Kind of thing. And it's kind of like, it's really interesting to sit there and try not to take it personally, because that is something else I just want to kind of throw out there is as you deal with this, as librarians deal with this, as you as a teacher or whatever part you're playing in the Literacy Association deals with people who come in, it is vitally important for your own self-preservation to not take it personally. Yeah. And so it was great fun to listen to an hour of him stabbing at my professionalism while telling me that I didn't know what I was talking about, you know, and throwing all kinds of racist ideology at me. And, you know, it's hard. I'm still struggling with that. I think I may have taken it a little personally, but to bring that up, that these are not easy conversations. And when you have to step up and be the person who explains it to somebody who thinks they already know. Yeah. It becomes really hard.
It is true. And I'm seeing some conversation coming up in the chat. Molly Ness says she's asking, how do we take the light away from the loudest voice when surveys show that the loudest voice is actually the minority? Mm-hmm. And I do want to bring up an example that happened this week in the area where I live. Columbia County in Georgia had a book challenge, and it was during the school board meetings. Mm-hmm. And this particular group came and they were complaining about this book and just complaining. They would come to every school board meeting and they would take up their, you know, little 3-minute slots. And what they found out, what this particular group of concerned parents found out, was that the group complaining about the book was not even in that school system, had no kids in that school system. They were just coming in and causing problems. And so these parents got together and they committed to attending the next school board meetings, and they all prepared their little thing, their talking points, and one after the other, they got up and talked 3 minutes after 3 minutes after 3 minutes after 3 minutes after 3 minutes. And what they did is they viscerally and visually presented an example of how they were the majority. And I think, Molly, to your question and to the point that's coming afterwards is that, yes, these things are getting weaponized. Like we talked about at the beginning of the panel, we're hearing this terminology be taken away, and it's on us we've got to start working more actively with parents. And if you're a teacher, if you're an educator, a school librarian, and you're also a parent, put on your parent hat, bring in your parent friends, do what you can, because we are going to have to just be the louder voice by being visually more present at these school board meetings, present at running for school board positions if possible, present at being out there in your community, meeting with folks, bringing in your crew, and being present, being visual, not letting them forget that you are the majority, in fact, and that you have a stake in that system, you have a stake in that school. So I do just want to bring that up because I think it's important that we do that. Valerie, did you have something? I thought you made a noise. Sorry. Can you hear me, Valerie?
Yeah, yes.
Oh.
Yes.
So maybe I can just pull it over this way. Oh, no, you don't have to move. I can move this way. Thank you. Thank you.
Just a reminder, everyone, to make sure your microphones are muted unless you're speaking. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, you gave an interesting example, and I haven't abroad. I haven't heard about this type of example. So maybe it's very, I don't know, American. People just complaining about books in district boards. I don't know.
Yeah, I think every setting has a different way that this plays out. So that is actually a good point, Valerie. I'm interested, what are ways that you see censorship playing out in France? And what are some other censorship stories that you have heard when you talk to the School Library SIG committee?
In France, censorship is more about, I think, self-censorship, because some school librarians, some are worried about pushing in some books in their school library because of sensitive subject about sexuality, or they are afraid to shock students, but there are no outside censorship or censorship from the headmaster and so on. And in other countries, as I said at the beginning, it's more, it depends on what type of countries, like in China or in Russia, as I said, it seems like there are like official, law about what to provide to children, like in Russia. But also my Russian colleagues told me that the Russian government gives a list of textbooks approved by the Russian Federation. And I think yes, in European country, as I said, it's maybe there are censorship about some religious subject. Maybe there is a difference between school with Catholic schools and something like that, and public school, because I think it's my English colleagues who told me that maybe in religious schools it's important to not shock the belief of children, but I think there are no real censorship from the headmasters.
I think that that's a really good point that you brought up, Valerie. Two things that jump out at me. First, you talk about the concept of self-censorship. We know that self-censorship is a serious problem.
Mhm.
And like Stephen is bringing up in the chat, some of the self-censorship we see does happen because of your sense of insecurity in your employment. But the other side of that is also just because sometimes school librarians are part of the problem. We say that sometimes the call is coming from inside the house. And so that's, again, a reflection we need to have. The other thing you brought up, Valerie, is you talked about how, this is the type of censorship that is happening in other countries. And if you're on this call and this webinar today and you're a North American, what I want to call on you to do is to think about censorship beyond the United States as also being present in the United States or in Canada. Don't fall into this sense of comfort that somehow we have more freedom here than any other country in the world. I think the more you talk to other educators and other school librarians in other countries, the more you see that we have a lot more in common than we realize. And it's important and vital to keep these global exchanges of practice open, because you're going to see that there are some things happening here that are very similar to, when we say, oh, at least we're not this country, or at least we're not that country. It's happening here too. And to see how other professionals are handling it in their countries is a great lesson and model for how you can handle it here and pull you out of your silo of thinking. So anyway, I just want to thank you, Valerie and Jonathan, for this conversation. And thank you for those throwing their wonderful wisdom into the chat. Very grateful for that. I think we are about ready to move to the next part of tonight's activities. Is that right? Okay, sounds good.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you for this amazing conversation. You certainly opened my eyes to these conversations happening all over the globe. That was new to me. And I assume it was new to many of our participants tonight. So it is now your collective turn to talk. For the next half an hour, you will be able to have conversations with breakout groups of your choosing. If you are joining us on Facebook, we are sorry to see you go, but we are going to be closing down the live streaming. Please note that the conversations in the breakout rooms are not being recorded. We just want to give you the chance to connect with colleagues, to reflect, and to go deeper on specific topics which are listed on the slide. You absolutely have the freedom to leave your current conversation and choose a different space at any time. All you do is you click your leave breakout button to return to the main room. And from there, you can choose to go into another breakout room. Once we are all set to move into these discussion spaces, we will see you back here together in 30 minutes. Thank you. So I'm seeing the numbers trickle back up, meaning I think you have returned from your breakout groups. I was fortunate enough to jump in to 2 different groups and had fascinating conversations with colleagues in New Zealand, grappled with how we support early career teachers. So I hope you learned as much as I did. And I hope that you will take these conversations with you tonight and continue them with your ILA colleagues, continue them online. And I do just want to take another opportunity to thank our guests as well as everyone who joined us tonight for this discussion. I want to give a tip of the hat to the hardworking staff at ILA who not only spent time preparing these questions, preparing a format that allowed us not only to hear from some thought leaders, but also to hear from each other, which is something we haven't had enough time to do. So thank you so much to the ILA staff for this. And the recording will be available. If any of you have colleagues who couldn't attend for whatever reason, you will be able to access that at literacyworldwide.org/digital events. And I want to give a mark your calendar heads up for some additional ILA events. The first one being the Ila Intensive, which is Thursday, March 12th from 1 to 4. Join JC Ippolito as he joins this event focusing on coaching and literacy leadership. Rita Bean will be the keynote speaker, and joining her and JC for a conversation will be Pamela Mason, Benjamin Piper, and Adam Bresky-Ulensky. Visit literacyworldwide.org/digital events for more information on this, and keep your eye peeled for the ILA digital events webpage for on-demand content and upcoming webinars. And just one more announcement before we head off for the evening, or morning, as my New Zealand colleague was joining us from. ILA recently extended the nomination deadline for its 2023 30 under 30 list. The deadline is now June 30th, 2022. You can submit a nomination for an emerging leader in the literacy field, librarian, educator, researcher, nonprofit leader, or a literacy advocate of any kind. If there is someone in your network who's transforming literacy instruction, literacy classrooms, schools, or communities, we want to know. For more information and the nomination form, visit literacyworldwide.org/30 under 30. Thank you so very much for joining us today. And thank you so very much for the literacy advocacy that you're doing all around the world for children. Have a great day and be sure to stay involved with ILA.